Thank you very much, Salim, Katie, Laura, Tyler. Thank you to everyone who has made this conference possible. It is so exciting to see so many people that are tuning in and getting in the seminar or this keynote and continue engaged. I was looking yesterday at the hashtag of the conference, if I can remind you, is BLRCC3, Barry Lawrence Ruderman Conference on Cartography #3. It's just incredible to see. I would just resonate with the land acknowledgement, this community and a very inclusive community that is formed virtually through the work we're all doing here. And I thank you all participants in making that possible. So I want to introduce our speakers today. This is the keynote from Eric Anderson and Carrie Cornelius. I did not introduce myself. I'm Alberto Diaz-Calleros, Director of the Center for Latin American Studies here at Stanford University. Eric Anderson and Carrie Cornelius, they're from the Haskell Indian Nations University. Eric Anderson holds a doctorate in American history from the University of Kansas, specializing in American Indian cultures and the history of the United States West. He's an enrolled member of the citizen Potawatomi Nation and teaches at Haskell Indian Nations University in Lawrence, Kansas. His major research focus is on American Indian education, especially the system of federal boarding schools established for Native youth in the late 19th century. Carrie Cornelius is the librarian at Haskell Indian Nations University, where she values the traditional perspectives of her students from over 100 tribes. In her work to increase access to information, she lifts the students and people of her community to value their own traditional knowledges. And I think it's particularly significant that we have a librarian join us as safekeepers of all this knowledge and sharing it with others. Maternally, Carrie is a member of the Prairie Band of Potawatomi. Paternally, she's of Oneida tribe of Wisconsin. So please, Eric and Carrie, the Zoom is yours.
Good morning, I'm Carrie Cornelius, Prairie Band, Potawatomi, and Oneida. I'm from Haskell Indian Nations University as a librarian, not a cartographer. Conference thank yous. On behalf of our students, I would like to begin by thanking the David Rumsey Map Center, Catherine Parker, and G. Salim Mohammed for recognizing the importance of Indigenous mapping for this year's Barry Lawrence Ruderman Conference on Cartography. I would also like to recognize our current researchers for practicing sovereignty in their respective fields using unique mapping techniques and technologies to meet the needs of Indigenous people today. I'd also like to start with a land acknowledgement for our lands of Haskell. And these are the current keepers of our Haskell lands. Our Haskell lands are kept by students, faculty, and staff who are all members of federally recognized tribes. We continue to keep our lands by singing, drumming, learning Indigenous languages, and also learning Indigenous sports. This is a picture of our cemetery that has 112 tribal students, recognized as the second cemetery that's on our location. And this is when we were titled the United States Indian Industrial Training School. This is last week, where our students were told, taught our history, and recognize our students that did not survive their time here at Haskell by the orange shirt walk and ceremony. I wanted to give you a chance to see Haskell going from the past, from the future going to the past. So today's Haskell students, we have currently 125 students, or 125 tribes represented within our students, with the Navajo Nation being first, Cherokee Nation, and Muskogee Creek next. And now I want to start with the most popular Indigenous map for our students, the Snapchat map, with the Indigenous content of themselves. And if you notice in the lower right, there is our medicine wheel, which was our opening slide. We're going to take a break here just to like check for our notes on here. And I might need to pop this up again. Do you see our presentation again?
Not yet. I think you probably have to stream it into the presenter mode, because that would allow you to see your notes on your end and us see the presentation at the same time.
Yeah, I had just lost them. But you see our...
Not yet. You need to share the screen again.
At least we're getting this one figured out before yours.
What good would be a Zoom conference without some glitch happening as we do it? I mean,
Thank you, Alberto. Do you see us now?
Yes, thank you. But now we see your notes actually.
No, that's fine.
Yeah, that's
just
it.
hit there. Yep, perfect.
Stop it. Yep.
It's perfect now?
Yeah, stop that.
No,
click,
hit that. Hit the switch button.
There we
That
go.
one.
Now we're good?
No, now it's stuck showing us you're clicking.
Can you click it again?
The switch.
Yeah, the switch bit.
So how about now?
I would try it
You're
again.
stuck on that one.
Yeah, display settings one more time, and I think that might work.
Now.
Yes.
Yes.
Woohoo!
Great.
And we made it to our current Snapchat map. So I'd like to welcome you to Haskell, and we're going to go back in the past according to maps that we have. This is our current Haskell map made by students in a GIS class through a National Science Foundation grant. To the right, you can see the original land of Haskell in yellow and our current land in red. And you can now see the style starting to change by looking at the buildings and seeing the federal gray beige brick. Real Cloud was built in the shape and style, honoring our 4 directions. And from our future, that was our first building that started to reflect Indigenous architecture. This is the next oldest map in 1936, courtesy of our cultural center. And you can see some of the main buildings that are represented there, the ones in yellow. And this is my last slide. These are our oldest pictures of Haskell when it was the United States Indian Industrial Training School. So from today, where we celebrate our cultures, you will note the assimilation and acculturation of our past. And I give you now over to Dr. Anderson.
Thank you, Carrie. I'd like to echo your sentiments of gratitude to the organizers of the conference and to all of the folks who are able to join us today. Thanks for bearing with some little technical hiccups there. But I think it's really important what Carrie was trying to get across to you in terms of telling you who we are as a university, and also, as many of you may know, that history of Haskell being a federal boarding school. At least that's how it started, and so assimilation and colonization are very much part of the foundations of our school. And I want to clarify too, I am not a cartographer. My training is as an historian, that you heard from Alberto's introduction. But I think those perspectives are important when we think about mapping. So if we take it even further back, the history of colonial mapping of native North America, or of the Americas, reflects that perspective of outsiders, with a focus on discovery, the big quotation marks around that, conquest and control. So I wanted to look at a few kind of classic examples of that. And this 16th century map entitled America, I again put in quotation marks, so what's in a name, right? The map shows the incursion of Spanish colonizers and indicates a widespread sense of control and conquest by the ships that you see, the navigation around these supposedly new lands where, of course, people already lived. The same thing here with this Mondo Nuevo, or New World. This is, of course, from the perspective of Europeans, suggesting discovery, ignoring indigenous populations already here. This French map from the 18th century of the Great Lakes shows colonial renaming, as do the previous two, but here it's on both the lands and the peoples, as you see the Hurons and Iroquois designated with names that they did not use for themselves. It's interesting to point out that the map maker here noted in his journals the potential for profit of agricultural products for Europeans. So again, that idea of discovery, conquest, control of resources of land. And this one, 17th century, is particularly interesting if you look at those, and some of you may be familiar with these maps. But the upper left and lower right quadrant showing the importance of growing slave trade and interactions with Native Americans. These next two, before I kind of move on from this section, this is a detailed French map, 16th century. Kind of by default, I guess, shows the importance of circularity in indigenous epistemologies by showing the layout of this Iroquois or Haudenosaunee village. And you see how it is formed in the shape of a circle. And that circularity is going to be very important in the remarks that I make throughout this presentation, or my portion thereof, in that interconnectedness. Very different than the Western linear concept and the right angles that you often see in Western conceptions of things. And also that circularity goes back to the four cardinal directions that Carrie mentioned in looking at that row cloud architecture. It also offers a sense of the cultural complexity of these peoples that newcomers refer to as savages. Of course, we know these are not simple people, these are complex societies, which I will get more into shortly. This is a very famous 1590 map on Algonquin settlement in the so-called Newfoundland of Virginia. Touched off British colonization of the eastern seaboard. And the depiction here is very much in keeping with the colonial perspective, the fascination with Indians that Thomas Harriot's original drawings inspired, and also concepts of primitivism. These are not primitive people, but that is the European, the Western perspective at that time. For Native people, kind of turning the lens around, there's an embrace of a holistic and reciprocal relationship with the land. It's not centered on discovery. It's not centered on conquest. It's not centered on control. It is what some scholars have called a land-based theology, constituting a living mapping of the world. And I have some pictures here that I think illustrate that. This first one of one of our elders, and here recognizing our late elder, Billy Frank Jr., recognizing partnership and importance of the natural environment. This picture from the effigy mounds is an example of the numerous earthen mounds built by various indigenous groups throughout what's now the United States. And it gives a powerful testimony to those created features of the landscape, things that are actually built into the landscape to signify connections to the land and to map out those spiritual connections to ancestors and to the earth itself. Now, this stunning shot showing the majestic beauty of the natural world, again, makes me think of how indigenous peoples held nature and the environment in such high esteem, with deep awe and reverence, so that rocks, trees, mountains, caves, wind, water, as well as plants and animals are seen as relatives, not resources, and so must be honored. This I see as a kind of living map, as many of these could be conceptualized. This is living our history, walking in the footsteps of ancestors. The trail is a journey relived and therefore a map of remembrance and shared sorrow at the removal of Southeastern tribal peoples. In this reconstruction of a traditional home, we see incorporated the gifts of nature that honor the sacrifices of earth and animals. And therefore, we could view it as a kind of interactive map, revealing the web of life, that interconnection, that circularity. With this rock carving, these are things, and I'll come back to this in a minute, that map sacred stories, symbols, events. You can note on this particular one the arrival of the Spanish illustrated there with the soldiers on horseback, as well as traditional cultural markers, such as agriculture and ceremony. Regalia or clothing may also speak to familiar stories or beliefs. They serve in a way as functional everyday maps that remind tribal people of their origins, their heritage, their connection to the living world. They're honoring. In this next section, I want to look at another kind of mapping, but it ties in. The relationship with the living world extends to a complex understanding and exchange with astronomical relatives. So our star knowledge, another part of our complex understanding and reckoning with the world that I see as an alternative form of mapping to the Western sense of what that means. In these Pawnee leggings, Pawnee people who see themselves as descendants of the stars regularly incorporate astronomical symbols into everyday life. And same with this drum. We see the morning star, the most important star, featured very prominently, and these thunder beings, these other living relatives that are around us in the heavens. The depth of scientific inquiry then and knowledge among Native North American people underscores a cultural complexity comparable to European counterparts, but one that has often been overlooked. And this is a map of constellations, the names of which you will most likely recognize as Western ones. So this is a comparative point in a lesson plan that looks at European and Native conceptions of constellations. But if we look at something like this, the Diné or Navajo cosmology, this star chart weaves stories of origin and culturally significant figures together into a broader understanding of celestial observations and meaning. In the center, then you see first man and first woman circling around the sacred fire. And again, that circularity and that interconnectedness is very apparent in this map. And Diné people would instantly recognize those features looking upward. Calendars, which I will talk about again in a moment, are also really important. This is a conceptualization of the Hopi knowledge of the sun cycle that affords complex knowledge of determination of seasonal ceremonies, planting, harvesting, other key events. And if we look at Hubbenweep National Monument, this place that was once referred to as a castle by non-natives, it's actually an observatory built by ancient Puebloan peoples. The ports face perfectly in anticipation of solar solstice and equinox cycles. And there's another view of that. Here's a diagram that illustrates it as well. How the ports align with the penetration of the sunlight at those various points of the cycle. And at Casa Ricananga, here we have summer solstice. This is another high altitude observatory built by the Anasazis, ancient Puebloans, at Chaco Canyon in New Mexico. And it's a representation of their cosmos, their cosmology and cosmogony, both the creation of everything and our place within it, our understanding, and the alignment with the summer solstice we see in this picture. The kiva is actually the centerpiece of Anasazi Pueblo culture, even today, and architecture. You notice the circularity. You know, it may be above ground or below. It's used for ceremony and other community functions. It represents the place of emergence for humanity. So again, you know, this is a different way of thinking about mapping than Western notions have generally embraced, or in some cases dismissed in an ethnocentric viewpoint of what mapping or cartography is. And that was a yellow jacket. This is again Casa Ricananda. The Kiva walls are circular, representing the sky. For the Acoma people, the support beams inside are made of 4 different trees. Again, that number 4, indicating the importance of cardinal directions. And in their case, it represents the Milky Way. So again, the complex layering of thought. You know, there's functionality, but there is symbolism and also deep, complex knowledge embedded in something that to outsiders might look quite simple and is anything but. This is the Great Kiva at Ricananda at about 64 feet or 20 meters. It's a particularly large one, the biggest at Chaco. And Chaco Canyon also had a very complex, impressive, really, system of roadways. This is, of course, a modern map, but it gives a sense of the connection between the various pueblos and settlements in that area. It is what Pueblo runners and travelers would have navigated in this complex society. The roots were likely committed to memory, but the creation of visible pathways demonstrate a mapping of the land itself, much like modern highways. I just wanted to include this one at Pueblo Bonito because Pueblo Bonito is this is the entire complex, covering some 3 acres, housing approximately 600 rooms, you know, a 4-story arrangement. Again, you know, very impressive complex network of communication, of understanding, and scientific insight. It's the largest apartment building in what's now North America or the United States until the 19th century. Predates it by hundreds of years. I wanted to come back to our etchings, our Puebloan petroglyphs that highlight things like the importance of the sun, as you see here, to all life, to human life, as you see particularly in these examples. These I would submit are essentially representational maps that encompass key cultural beliefs, and they're markers in the land. They're maps as well. They remind us of things. They symbolize things. They indicate the importance of ideas. This one is also features core spiritual animals, casinos. We may not entirely know the meaning behind them now, but we can see the significance of them, and they have lasted all of this time. In this one, according to the author, from which I sourced here, the warrior shield may represent the rays of the sun, but the center of the shield does represent morning star, evening star, two other bright stars, and two circles that are probably the moon. So again, there are details of astronomical observation which would be instantly recognized by those viewing such representations of the cosmos and our place within it. Sounds very much like a map. This Pawnee star chart, and again, the Pawnees seeing themselves as descendants of stars. This one is on leather. May have once been part of a sacred bundle, which were held by the knowledge keepers of the people. Many of the known constellations are configured here, and those are the larger star-shaped or cross-shaped figures, and then in the smaller band in the middle is the Milky Way, which they call the pathway of the departed. So when someone died, they went back up into the stars to join their ancestors. This is a diagram of the Bighorn Medicine Wheel in Wyoming, sacred site to a number of Northern Plains tribes, probably in the range of 1,000 years old. It's long been used as a place of healing, seeking visionary insight, but it also functions as an observatory with the cairns there set out according to major celestial events in the the summer sky. There may be up to about 150 of these medicine wheels that survive on the Northern Plains in both the US and Canada. Again, a central feature is the recognition of 4 cardinal directions, orienting native mapping across many indigenous North American cultures. And in thinking back to all of those different examples of circularity as well, right back to the beginning with Haskell's medicine wheel. And then there are other types of mapping that orient native peoples to their environment and surrounding. I mentioned the Hopi Sun calendar earlier. This is a calendar history of the Kiowa Indians. And of course, history is embedded into maps as well. As over time, we've gained more knowledge or different perspective, as we continue to do with new digital technologies. So we think about the historical component of mapping. I wanted to include calendrics as well. They record significant events, movements, ceremony. In this case, usually divided biannually into summer and winter seasons. They're telling stories for posterity about the life of the people, so they're mapping in that way too. And then the winter counts, this one from the Sioux, recorded on buffalo hide. Other historical systems of mapping like these are called winter counts. This one follows along in a 70-year cycle, traditional 70-year cycle. So it's from 1800 to 1870. It records memorable hunts, interactions with other tribes, with non-natives, celestial events, epidemics of disease, and other things. And again, that circular pattern, where with most Western maps, the orientation is with right angles. The land itself, not necessarily so, of course, but the orientation of the maps is quite different from this circular fashion. And in this case, the recording is spiraling out from the center, so from oldest to newest occurrences. And here we have a Dakota winter count, Medicine Bears winter count. Do you want to add anything? And Carrie actually got to see this with her own eyes. I've only seen the pictures. I know that just as with other winter counts, it records key events in history. It maps those for the people to remember. And I recall that she said one of the features here was what they had referred to as the stars falling down to earth. And I believe that's what you see there in the left hand portion of the slide. Some celestial event, a meteor shower, something of that nature. Here's a little bit better picture. You may not be able to see it so well from your perspective, but towards the middle, there are depictions of conflict with other tribes and also with the soldiers with guns, U.S. soldiers. So I wanted to also talk a little bit about encounters between natives and newcomers that yielded some innovations in mapping and some crossover. And so these next three slides look at indigenous maps from what was called New Spain or Mexico by outsiders. It's been the land of the Aztec people. These are really intriguing because they combine European and indigenous styles of cartography and a mixture too. They represent drawings of town sites that were commissioned by Spanish officials who relied on indigenous informants and traditional knowledge and traditional maps. This one is from a place in Veracruz and appears to be a visualization of land that's oriented around a central plaza, which is, of course, very familiar in the southwestern landscape today, in the colonizer landscape. But central plazas were also used by different native people. We see roadways also leading out from both directions, top and bottom. I don't know, well, you can make that out, but there are footprints there. It's a very kind of native symbolism of travel. Leading out to outlying indigenous villages. So you see, for instance, on both ends, the top and bottom, those little native thatched roof chapels. So we get an impression of the separation of the center of the colonial town site, but also the reach of colonization in terms of the missionary impulse. This second one, this Relación Geográfica, as the official Spanish geological records were called, or geographical records, I'm sorry, is in Hidalgo state and combines different cultural concepts of mapping. It was created by a Spanish clerk, but with the assistance of four Aztec officials and a number of native elders. So there are indigenous glyphs that you see, the kind of amorphous shapes, for instance, around the edges. But the written explanations are coming from the Nahuatl language of the Aztecs, but they're written in European script. So this is a map that clearly has a mixture of both Aztec and Spanish influence, and to some extent the authority of each. And then this one, which really contains two maps, is also a contrast in cultural interpretation, mixing Spanish with Aztec glyphs, significant features of the landscape, which would be important to both. The missionary zeal of the newcomers, because right there in the center is the church, Christian church with the cross on top. But sort of weaving through the entire template here is that snaking line that is following indigenous plant life of the area. This one is something that has begun to really engender a lot of contemporary research. This is the so-called Miguel Map. It's actually 1602. The Juan de Onate expedition that took place in 1601 included a pitched battle between natives in what is today Kansas and the Spanish. And in the aftermath of that, the Spanish took a captive known simply to them or dubbed by them Miguel, who accompanied the conquistadors back to Mexico City. It was there that the Spanish officials compelled him to draw a map of his homeland in the interest of procuring gold and other resources that they were interested in. Again, that emphasis on control, resource, discovery. And so what results from this is the so-called Miguel Map, which is the oldest indigenous rendering of any part of today's United States. It focuses on landscape, but in terms of spatial connection, not really in terms of political or economic priorities. So the landscape here is especially showing the huge native settlement of what's come to now be known as Etzanoa, one of the largest settlements, it's now believed, of native people in North America. And we're finding out more and more about this. This is from a colleague, Donald Blakeslee's work, not the map itself, but his research into this city of Etzanoa. It even gives us some indication of a complex system of long distance trade that linked native people in North and South America, because Miguel referred to places where gold were smelted that are nowhere near Kansas or even North America. One thing to note on this is that the native orientation. In this case, what would ordinarily be north on a Western map at the top is actually at the left of the map. This was a very complicated procedure to extricate this map because the communications between Miguel and the Spanish interrogators consisted of a lot of hand signals and various attempts to communicate through different native languages, but none of them really knew his language. So it left it very open to interpretation at the time, but modern research shows that he produced a remarkably accurate map entirely from memory. And I think that's important because, again, the kind of etching into the mind of Native people, whether it be star knowledge, whether it be the expression of etching into petroglyphic form, or that living mapping, expressing the interconnectivity of all life, I think is kind of seen here in a way that may remind us of a European or Western map, but has a very different perspective within it. I just got a few more here, and I'm trying to keep within our timeline. Carrie's going to wrap up with a couple slides of her own. But this is another map that contains methods of cartography that are both Indigenous and American. It's a French version of an Indian map. Of course, colonizers were seeking greater knowledge of the American terrain occupied by natives, or they wanted to obtain that knowledge from natives who knew the landscape best. So they recopied them then into a fashion that was more familiar to their own way of doing so. This map is one that probably came from the Shawnee Indians. It looks at settlements and landmarks along the Mississippi. This one, I think we decided is our favorite image that we include here today. Again, it's a copy of an original native map, a Catawba map drawn on deer skin, much like the winter counts. So these are people of the Tidewater. It's really interesting to me because it shows on the one side the circularly arranged villages of the natives, and then over on the other side, the right angular grids of the streets of Charleston. It's Charlestown, but Charleston, South Carolina, and you've got the ship out there in the harbor. It almost kind of looks like a balloon coming down, but it's actually a ship. And then there's some other figures in there too. There's there are human figures, but overall there's a very much an animal symbolism to this, with the triangles probably representing the actual deer hooves that were on the map itself. So the map being made out of deer skin, showing that connection to the animal relatives. This is a map with an incredibly long name. I'll shorten it and say it's an Indian map of the different tribes that inhabit the east and west side of the Rocky Mountains. The title goes on quite a bit longer. A couple of hundred years after the Miguel Map, this was one that again was redrawn and annotated by someone of European descent, an employee of the Hudson Bay Company, but it retains some rather native features of the original that was given by a Blackfoot chief, whose name in English was Feathers, originally Okamoki. That's my best attempt at Blackfoot. The interest of trading companies, of course, was to have reliable geographic information. So this is fascinating, however, because I believe that in looking at these maps that show a mixture of indigenous and Western concepts of cartography, we can begin to get at a place where we can decolonize and re-indigenize the mapping of sacred lands. And I'll just look at it, I'll just point this out. This is from cartographer Margaret Pierce. I just took this from my own tribal newspaper. I know you can't see the image very well, but the headline, I think, is what's critical. She's very interested in presenting maps in an indigenous way that relate to those stories, that relate to those symbols, that relate to those origin ideas, that relate to our relationship with the natural environment. So how could we conceptualize maps that are more indigenized in that way, and maybe expressed also in a sense that Western cartographers are more familiar with, but that has included in it a traditional indigenous sense of identity. And so I think we just have a few left. I'm going to yield the floor back to Carrie.
Our next map is one that you can have access to even within a phone app. It's used easily when you are traveling, developing your land acknowledgements. And, you know, the land acknowledgements have come around just the last couple years. And the most important part of a land acknowledgement is not only recognizing the people, but also going to make a change within your small society, wherever you decide to do your land acknowledgement, but to make that change of reciprocity towards the students, since these are really going out with university pushes. But we probably even have the same people that made this map attending this conference, but we really thank you for your efforts with this. Dr. Emerson, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I would just, on the medicine wheel, we showed this at the beginning, again, emphasize the importance of circularity in Indigenous thinking, Indigenous American thinking, that interconnectedness, the never-ending cycle, quite different from the conception of straight lines and right angles that are more familiar in the European or Euro-American tradition. The cardinal directions, as we see on the Haskell medicine wheel, this is on our campus, it's an aerial shot. And then the thunder beam that you see coming in from the top. Again, that very clear connection to our other than human relatives, you know, even relatives that some people would dismiss as a myth or legend, but that are so central to Native belief. And finally, the actual mapping of the earth itself and the cardinal directions that are so central. With those cardinal directions, very often those are reoriented from how Western thinkers conceive of them. So perhaps east, south, west, north, rather than north, south, east, and west, or something of that type. And I think you have one final one you want to talk about.
Yeah. Being from a university, it seems that, especially we have 700 students from 125 tribes, that we really look at the healing of our students, the development of pride that our students are just learning. Probably half of our students are coming from native land, and then half of the students are coming from non-native land, such as cities in here. And while we were looking over the different evidence of our Indigenous maps, we placed them in the blue area and kind of grouped them by 4 different topics of ceremony, time, space, and those related to history. And the next gray area, we're looking at more of the application. How are they being used? And I tried to keep them, you know, in relation from the time to the Chaco sun daggers, and working out towards the digital humanities, or you know, Mashana Goman yesterday talking about the UCLA Indigenous story maps coming out with the spatial. We have some more tools using the GIS and technologies, you know, with the past slide of the native land, our native land, that link, and the work of Nachi Barn with the teacher instruction that he's doing within his state. So you're seeing, as you go out, you're seeing more of the examples and application of Indigenous mapping. We really like to point out the architecture, uses in architecture, and having students find places of home in where a place that they're they're not comfortable, where they're pushed into different challenges. So we just like to leave you with this model, and I'm going to thank you for your time. And I think we're ready for some questions, if you have any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this. This has been an incredible kind of bookend in some ways, with some continuity and obviously difference from the things we started with Alex Hidalgo 2 days ago. And I think it's fantastic to see how all the different panels would talk to each other, speak to each other, even as they were dealing with very different issues. I want to just point out, we have a few things going on the chat that are, you have your fans, Carrie. So I want to tell you just that Lorian Roy sends you greetings, but also I believe must be Ignacio Carvajal, the Quiche poet, who's also sending greetings to you. So happy to see people also making community through the chat. I want to start first with one question from Vera Dorofiva Lichtman. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing this right. This is a question to Eric. And she says, you currently refer to copies of native maps by the Western scholars, quotations. Are there any survived or originals we could compare them with? Why one needed to copy the original maps rather than acquiring them?
Yeah. It's a great question. That's one of the things that we really ran up against in our research in putting this together, and we intended this, in many ways as a survey rather than an original foray, of our own. And so we relied on other scholars, obviously, as we all do. But to your point, one of the things that we found in looking about for sources, as kind of secondary researchers here, is that so many of the original native created maps, whether they be in a more westernized kind of familiar style, or whether they be something like the Pawnee leggings or the drum, are essentially owned by Western institutions, and that is to an extent rather shocking in light of something like NAGPRA that's now been around for 30 years with the legislation to repatriate things. So that I think is part of our rationale for including those Western sources, and I think that that's some work we, not just the two of us, but that we all need to do in terms of trying to decolonize that. For instance, one of the things that Carrie was I'm trying to think of a diplomatic way to say it, was unhappy about, was with the Von Chamberlain slides that we showed of the Pawnee pieces. Those he had to recreate them. He had to draw them because the Field Museum at that time in Chicago would not even give an allowance for that to be put into a photographic content. So I think you make a really valid point, and that is another step that needs to be taken in the decolonization process overall.
I'm not going to take exactly in order the questions, just because there is a question that is just going around, I think, in everyone's minds, and there's various versions of the same question, but it is whether it is possible to have access to the copyrighted chart you showed us at the end. It's just, I think people were blown away by it. So I think there are a couple of requests that I cannot completely keep track of them, but I think there's a lot of excitement about that. Also thinking about the pedagogical element. So I don't know if you want to tell us a little bit, share with us about how you do this pedagogy. How do you teach something like that chart that you show, that model, as you pointed out at the end? Yeah.
I think if you go down, I don't know if you can see it. It's not shared. I'm not touching that again. But I think within the spatial concept, Haskell does teach GIS. And the way that it's incorporated, I don't exactly know how it is, but from speaking to students, even yesterday, someone was helping them in the computer lab, and he was, printing something related to his GIS. And I said, "How do you like the class?" And he said, I really love it. I really love the technology of it and how to apply it." And I said, "How is that?" He said, "We can really identify our lands." And what happened yesterday on the 21st is some of our Potawatomi lands, the Chabanais lands in just by Chicago, it was decided by the state to return some of those lands to the tribe, which is very exciting for a prairie band Potawatomi to have our lands given back. So, I think a lot of the repatriation of the items is it's going to be a very, very hard time until the April. Dr. Anderson is actually working with the team that's working for Deb Holland in the Department of Interior that is investigating the boarding school deaths. I was certain to put in, a picture of our cemetery, and we're learning of our histories as a boarding school, as a federal boarding school, and we're preparing. Even within the library, we're preparing healing spaces for our students and faculty when that news comes out of when they use the ground penetrating sonar to find the bodies of our students. So it may not be straight through pedagogy, but I know in our summer environmental science programs, the HERS program, Haskell Environmental Research Studies program, they have in-depth time with our Dr. Josh Meisel with GIS, and all of them will incorporate their maps on their posters for their presentations. So I know within two structured programs between having classes and also through the HERS program.
Thank you so much for that, because I think the spirit of the question was also about this healing process, and I think you answered it really, really nicely. I want to point out again, I'm sorry I'm not going exactly in order as we had promised, but there's just a flurry of activity going on in the chat and the Q&A. I do want to point out, thinking about this restorative aspect, Joanne Richardson shared in the chat this restorative cartography of rivers website. So I just want to, of the Teakiki region, mapping Potawatomi preferences in Indiana. So I just want to point out that resource there. And the same thing, our keynote speaker from earlier yesterday, Mishwana Goeman, was she a keynote? I cannot remember anymore. But anyway, Mishwana showed us this incredible thing about mapping native land in LA and in Southern California. So I want to ask explicitly her question, even though it's not exactly in the order. I will get to the other one, sorry. But she asks, so who is creating more of a dialogue to in some ways reclaim land, to get land back through these exercises? How do we approach this idea of using the maps in a more, proactive way, if I can rephrase what she asked?
See you looking at me.
You want to speak to that first? I have an idea as well. But
How about if you go with yours?
okay.
And then,
Yeah, I mean, I think there is, particularly one of the things of teaching here at Haskell, it's really unique. There are other tribal colleges and universities, of course, but at ours, we are the national tribal university, and we represent so many different tribal nations in such a small overall number of students. So this is a question, I guess, that is on the minds of a lot of our folks on campus, students, faculty alike. How do we, in this time period when we are, I think, across the board trying to reckon with the colonial history and legacies of the United States and even what came before, whether that be, with racial justice or gender equality or historical reimagining. That question of land back is one that's certainly swirling around. It's wonderful that universities and cities and other places are making land acknowledgements, and I think that's an important first step. But I do believe the push to actually repatriate land is there, as Carrie mentioned, with the Potawatomis up a little north of us, Delaware, the tribe who was originally from this, they were removed, but were once here in this area and then removed again, have repatriated land. And I think, you're absolutely right. A lot of those claims have to be predicated upon what can be proved in sort of a Western methodology. By the same, the irony that you have to be a member of a federally recognized tribe to come to school at Haskell means that if your tribe was essentially wiped out at one time, then you no longer have the privilege of being recognized by the federal government. But those are the parameters in which we operate. We're still, living under a jurisprudence of the doctrine of discovery and other things. But I think proving those cases on native ground, and I'll use that as a kind of a pun, but using Western methodologies, at least in part, to get there, will produce some results in turning back turning back over some of that land to us, and we appreciate the work that you're doing in that area. Because I think we have to be respectful of the fact that we still live in a colonized colonial society, and so we're going to have to use the tools of the colonizers in order to achieve that justice.
I really, I think I have a lot of faith in our students, and their creativity is beyond mine. I recognize that now, as I become older, but referring to the model, I just feel like there's going to be so many more examples on the outside of those circles that are going to be exploding, just as our research and our literature that has happened since the pandemic. So our students are given the tools. Each tribe has their own sovereignty, so they're structured differently. Not every tribe is like their knowledge base. It may not be repatriation. Their knowledge base may be focused elsewhere. But when our students go to their treaty courses and our students learn GIS and they learn some of the law courses, then their minds, with their young minds, are seeing answers that I know I haven't seen before. So that's very exciting.
Okay, I am realizing through the chat that there's something that has not been working in Zoom today, where the chat is not being shared to all the participants. So we will figure out a way to make sure that some of these resources are shared widely with the people who have been engaged in this discussion. I apologize for that. So I do realize that I see a chat that not everyone else in our audience of almost 200 people that I see still here with us are not being able to see. Let me share with you Maria Laura Pensas. I know you've been patient, those of you who have posted things on the Q&A. She says, this is not a question, but she wants to thank you for this talk. It has been one of the most enlightening and profound insights I have heard in this conference, and there have been so many. This work is so relevant for the folks beginning to work on indigenous mapping in the global south and contesting the cartography of the state. Thank you for this final chart also. the same flavor I want to share with you is in the chat. Karen A, she tells us that land back for ownership and control, if not owned, and finding options, I think, to access federal and state lands to practice traditional and sustainable agriculture is being forwarded to recent context in the Secretary of Agriculture. And she does kind of ask, how do we get this kind of, connection between Secretary of Agriculture and the cartography and get access to some of your maps. I will go into a question from Karen Church. I'm sorry, I'm trying to rush into a series of things, but Karen asks, she's studying maps for purposes of looking at the walking time in North America. This is the time before horses in this modern era. So what she's a doctoral candidate, and she asked very pointedly is, do you have indications in the maps you have studied of long-range travel that is being done for purposes that are other than trade? I imagine she's asking about, other dimensions, cultural dimensions, religious dimensions of travel.
Yeah, well, thank you for those great comments in the preceding two that you read, Alberto. Yeah, this is a really great question. I don't know that I have enough expertise right at the moment to fully address that. Obviously, trade would be the thing that comes to mind first. The long distance trade, the complex system of trade that we know about, certainly would have motivated that type of travel predating the horse. With nomadic, peoples, and at one point, most indigenous peoples were, we go back into the distant past, predating the fixed agricultural villages. That kind of travel would most likely have been fairly localized, although that could range pretty far with seasonality in terms of the movement of big game. I'm not a paleontologist or someone who knows about the megafauna from a scientific viewpoint. So I don't know the range of those large animals like the mastodon and so forth in terms of how far hunters would have to go to pursue them. We do know in the more modern era with the buffalo, of course, they can range very widely, but their numbers were so vast that probably didn't require, I don't know what the range you're thinking of, but huge distances, probably not. And the other thing that comes to mind would just be of the migratory nature, as the Americas, were peopled over time. But my inclination on that one would be, that's a gradual process rather than one that, as you indicate, would be more akin to a trading motivation. So I'm fascinated by your question, and I'm sorry I don't have more concrete answers to offer.
No, thank you. I'm encroaching a couple of minutes into the break, but I promise I won't do much more than just a couple of more, one more question, I think. But I do want to mention Beth Keats shares with us something called Trailmark. And Salim has said that he will make a way for people to have access to all these resources that have been going on in the chat. But what she tells us is that in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada, they have developed a software and services that is used primarily by the Indigenous communities across Canada to map and monitor their lands according to Indigenous methodologies. They're using it for land claims, for resource management, for repatriation, and for governance. So this is fantastic that you share this with us. I want to end with one question from Mariana Balbuena. I think it's a hard question, but it goes in the spirit, I think, of what has happened here for the past 3 days. She asked to Dr. Anderson whether you have seen Maya maps from the 16th century. What are your thoughts on them? Because in Los Papeles de los Sioux de Yaca, for instance, there is the Memorial de la Distribución de los Montes. It was created in 1557, along with these papeles, with the purpose of helping the Sioux lineage to keep their privileges and land. So it has a lot of Spanish and indigenous elements. So I don't know if this is really, out there in terms of trying to draw connections in very broad areas, but I think it goes in the spirit of what we've been doing these days.
No, I love it. Obviously we focused on Native North America here. As we were looking at things, there were several that were tantalizing in terms of South American connections, but we had to draw a limit, I guess, for the purposes of time. But I appreciate that. That's something that I would love to look into further, and perhaps can be the subject of maybe not necessarily another presentation, but I'd like very much to incorporate that into some of the things that I do in the classroom. So I appreciate you pointing that out. I do think the connections, those kind of cross-pollinated maps, both in terms of their rationale and their execution, are vital, and really, in particular, the one you mentioned could be a great example of how we get to that repatriation question as well, in terms of this protection of rights and lands.
So I'm going to have to stop here the Q&A. We really do want to give you a little break before the next session. I do want to mention that we're going to take you on that invitation, Eric and Carrie. Sebastian Cacard actually was asking, can you tell us more about what the different circles mean? Can you tell us more about your own teaching, and full credit, of course, on this? I think it's a plea. Everyone wants to have like a whole session with you about that last model, and I think this is something that we should try to find a way to do together.
Yes, so very much, and thank you so much to everyone. And yeah, I got to give Carrie, really the credit for conceptualizing this. Although we kicked around some of the ideas together, this is really something that I'm super excited about too, and that she is largely responsible for, but there are elements, of course, in it that we put together, and we'll be happy to share it and to do some additional talking about it, if we can figure out how to set that up.
And sign up for a class with Dr. Anderson. You're Haskell.
Again, to everyone, thank you to our panelists. Thank you for this enthusiastic participation of everyone. And let's stay on for the next panel in 10 minutes. We take a 10-minute break, get some water, get some coffee. We have more to learn in the coming hours. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alberto. Thank you, everyone.